curtain on the fascinating tech that keeps our digital world humming. Today, we're unearthing something absolutely fundamental, yet, well, totally invisible to most of us. Caches. You know that constant demand for blazing speed and efficiency in digital systems? The need to slash latency and supercharge overall performance? Well, caches are a foundational answer to those challenges. This deep dive is all about revealing the core building blocks that make genuinely fast systems work. We're distilling the most important nuggets from the source material, breaking down complex concepts into understandable parts, so you can walk away truly well-informed about how caches actually function.
Yeah, and understanding these cache components isn't just for the engineers designing complex systems. It's actually incredibly valuable for, well, anyone curious about the unseen engineering, quietly making their everyday digital interactions feel instantaneous.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Our sources suggest that at its heart, a cache is fundamentally a simple yet powerful key value store. Can you maybe break down what that really means for someone who might not be familiar with that term?
Right. What's fascinating here is its primary purpose. It's basically to map a unique key to its corresponding data value. Simple as that. The core goal, though, this is key, is to achieve near instant or O1 average time complexity for both lookups and insertions.
Meaning it's super fast regardless of size.
Exactly. Think of O1 as meaning it takes roughly the same tiny amount of time to find what you're looking for, whether you have, say, 10 items or 10 million. It's incredibly fast. This crucial efficiency isn't just some technical spec, it's really the secret sauce. It's what transforms potentially slow database calls into the snappy, instantaneous digital experiences we pretty much expect now. The real insight here, I think, is that without this foundation, almost no modern high-performance system would even be possible.
That makes so much sense. And you see this concept implemented everywhere, don't you?
Oh, absolutely.
Whether it's a HashMap in Java, or a dict in Python, or std.unorderedMap in C++. These basic in-memory examples, they really show how you put in a key, like, say, user.1, and you get back its value, maybe Alice, almost instantly. So for us, what it means is this simple yet powerful concept forms the foundational layer. It's the starting point, really, upon which all the more complex cache behaviors are built.
Precisely. It's the bedrock.
So we've got this super fast key value store, but it's a finite resource, right? It can't hold everything forever.
That's the catch. It's limited.
Exactly. So what happens when it fills up? How on earth does a cache decide what data to, throw away to make space for new stuff coming in? This sounds like a really tricky problem.
It absolutely is. And this is where the critical concept of an eviction policy comes in. It's essentially the strategy, the set of rules for deciding which items get the boot. And these eviction policies directly impact the cache's hit rate.
Ah, the hit rate.
Yeah, which is basically how often the requested data is actually found in the cache. And that right there is a key measure of its effectiveness, how well it's doing its job. Our sources detail several common policies. First up, probably the most famous, is LRU. That's least recently used.
Okay, LRU.
It removes the item that hasn't been accessed for the longest time. It's very common, generally pretty effective. It's often implemented using, a combination of a HashMap and a doubly linked list, or sometimes built-in structures like LinkedHashMap in Java or OrderedDict in Python handle it for you.
Gotcha.
Then there's LFU. Least frequently used.
Okay, different approach. Yeah.
This one removes the item that has been used the least number of times. So it's about frequency, not just recency. But that means it has to constantly track access counts, which adds a bit of overhead.
Right, keeping score.
Exactly. Then there's FIFO, first in, first out.
Sounds simple.
It is the simplest. It just removes the oldest inserted item, the first one that came in, regardless of how often it's used or how recently. Straightforward, but maybe not always the smartest. And finally, there's also time-based expiry, or TTL, where items just get removed once a set time to live expires, no matter how much they're being used, which kind of leads into the next point, actually.
That's a great overview.
Yeah.
To make LRU a bit more tangible, maybe let's walk through a quick scenario. Imagine our cache can only hold, say, 3 items.
Okay, 3 items, small cache.
Right, so we put A, then we put B, then put C. So our cache now holds A, B, C, and at this point, A is the least recently used, right?
Correct. Oldest untouched.
Now, what if we then get item A?
Yeah, so you access A.
Yeah. Suddenly A is considered the most recently used. So the cache effectively reorders itself, maybe internally looks like B, C, A now.
A moves to the hot end.
Exactly. Then, if we try to put a new item, say D, the cache is full. It only holds 3.
Right, need to make space.
So LU kicks in and removes. Well, it removes B because B is now the one that hasn't been touched the longest, leaving us with C, A, D.
Perfect example. It dynamically adjusts based on usage.
It's a really smart way to try and keep the most relevant data close at hand, isn't it?
It really is a clever mechanism. And while LRU is often the default workhorse, the key insight here for system designers is realizing that no single policy is like a silver bullet.
Ah, okay. There's no one-size-fits-all.
Definitely not. For instance, if your data access pattern is really bursty, lots of sudden interest in new items, LFU might surprisingly underperform because it takes a while to build up frequency counts for those newly hot items. So choosing the right policy isn't just about knowing the rules, it's about having a deep understanding of your application's unique data access patterns. That's critical.
That's a crucial point. Okay, building on that idea of time-based expiry you mentioned, beyond just running out of space, why is it so important for cache data to not become stale? It's like checking the expiration date on your milk carton, but for data, right? Nobody wants to serve up sour data to their users. So how does this time to live or TTL mechanism work? Or sometimes it's an absolute expiry timestamp.
Exactly. That's a great analogy. Its core purpose is precisely that. Avoid serving outdated or stale data. The implementation usually involves storing an expiry timestamp right alongside the value in the cache. Then, before returning data from the cache, the system does a quick check. Has the current time zoomed past that expiry time? If it has, boom. The item is treated as a cache miss, even if it's technically still there. It gets evicted, and the system likely fetches fresh data.
So it's a proactive freshness check.
Totally. A concrete, real-world example you see a lot is the Redis expire command. You'd say expire key seconds, like expire user.1.profile3600 to keep it fresh for an hour. Our sources illustrate this with a concept like a cache item class that might have a method, like is expired, that simply returns true or false.
Simple but effective. Okay,
Yeah.
So we've got our data in the cache. It stays fresh thanks to TTL. But what happens when, multiple users or processes are all trying to grab and update that same data at the exact same time?
Right.
That just sounds like a recipe for chaos if it's not handled carefully. So what's the solution here? How do caches achieve concurrency handling or thread safety?
You've hit on a really key point there, because without proper concurrency handling, the risks are severe. You could face inconsistent data where one user sees one value and another sees something else, race conditions where operations interfere with each other in unpredictable ways, or even outright application crashes. It's serious stuff. To manage this, one common strategy is synchronization, basically using locks. Think of synchronized blocks or reentrant lock in Java, or maybe threading lock in Python.
So only one person gets the key at a time?
Essentially, yes. These ensure only one thread can modify the cache structure at any given moment. The downside is, if locks are held for too long, it can slow things down, create bottlenecks.
Performance hit, right?
Exactly. So another approach is using specifically designed thread-sage data structures. Things like concurrent HashMap in Java are brilliant for this. They are inherently designed for concurrent access and manage all the internal locking much more efficiently, often behind the scenes, reducing contention.
That sounds much better.
It often is for high-throughput systems. I actually heard a story once, maybe apocryphal, maybe not, about a financial system where a single missing lock on a cache update routine led to customers briefly seeing completely wrong account balances. Exactly. That's the kind of nightmare scenario that proper thread safety prevents. It's absolutely critical in production.
Wow. That's a chilling thought. It really emphasizes how critical this seemingly abstract concept is in the real world. Okay, let's bring it back to a fundamental realities cache. As we said, they're finite resources, right?
Always finite, yes.
So how do we actually keep them from gobbling up excessive memory and ensure they behave predictably? What's the actual mechanism for setting that boundary?
Right. That's where capacity limits come directly into play. It's pretty straightforward, actually. You define either a maximum number of entries the cache can hold, or maybe a maximum total memory size it's allowed to consume. The purpose is crystal clear. Stop the cache from just growing indefinitely and eating all available RAM. It ensures predictable resource usage.
And when it hits that limit?
Exactly. Once that limit is hit, it automatically triggers the chosen eviction policy we talked about earlier, like LRU or LFU, to make space for any new items coming in.
So capacity limits and eviction policies work hand in hand.
They're tightly coupled. The good news is many modern caching libraries offer built-in capacity management. They handle checking the limit and invoking the eviction policy automatically, which takes a lot of the headache out of it for engineers.
That's good to know those are often built in. Okay, now let's explore. Something you mentioned is optional, but sounds powerful. While caches are typically in memory for that lightning speed, what if we need that cache data to survive as a system restart? Or maybe stay perfectly in sync with the primary database? It feels like we'd need some kind of safety net.
You're spot on. That safety net is what we generally call a persistence layer. And yeah, it's optional, like you said, because not all caches need it, but it can significantly enhance a system. It provides things like fault tolerance, surviving crashes, and durability, often by keeping the cache data somehow synchronized with a primary data store, like a database or maybe even the file system. Our sources unpack 3 common patterns here, and they each have, well, pretty distinct trade-offs.
Okay,
First, there's write-through. With write-through, data is written to both the cache and the underlying database simultaneously, usually in the same operation.
So it's always consistent.
Exactly. It ensures strong consistency. The downside, it adds latency to your write operations because you have to wait for both the cache and the database write to complete.
Makes sense. Trade-off.
Right. Second pattern, write behind. Here, data is written to the cache first, which is fast, and then it's asynchronously written to the database in the background, maybe after a short delay or in batches.
Ooh, faster writes then.
Definitely offers lower write latency up front. But there's a risk. If the cache system crashes before that background write to the database happens, well, you could potentially lose that data. A small window of risk.
Right, eventual consistency, potential loss.
Yep.
Okay, what's the third one?
The third one, and arguably the most common pattern you see in practice, is cache aside, sometimes called lazy loading. Here, the application code explicitly manages the caching logic. When it needs data, it first checks the cache. If the data isn't there, that's a cache amiss the application, then goes and loads it from the database, stores it in the cache for next time, and then returns it to the caller.
So the application is doing the work of populating the cache.
Exactly. And typically, with cache aside, writes go directly to the database first, often invalidating the corresponding entry in the cache if it exists. This approach gives the application full control, which developers often like, but it also puts the responsibility squarely on them to implement the caching logic correctly.
Lots of different ways to handle persistence then.
Okay.
So we've built this potentially complex cache. How do we actually know if it's working well in the real world? Or, if it's struggling and maybe needs some optimization? What's the report card for a cache?
Yeah, that's absolutely vital. That's where monitoring and metrics become indispensable. You can't really run a cache in production without them. They provide those critical insights into cache performance and health. There are a few key metrics you really need to track.
Like what?
Well, first and foremost, cache hit rate. That's the percentage of requests that are successfully served directly from the cache. A high hit rate generally means efficiency and speed. The cache is doing its job well.
Makes sense. High is good.
High is good. Then its counterpart, the cache miss rate. Percentage of requests not found in the cache, meaning you had to go fetch it from the source, like the database. A high miss rate might suggest, well, maybe your cache isn't big enough, or perhaps your eviction policy isn't the right fit for your access patterns.
So that tells you maybe something needs tuning.
Precisely. We also track eviction count, just the raw number of items being removed, either due to capacity limits or TTL expiry. Gives you a sense of the churn. Latency is another big one, measuring the time taken for core cache operations, like get or put. Are they actually fast? And of course, memory usage. You need to know how much memory the cache is actually consuming to make sure it's behaving as expected.
Got it. And how do you track all this?
Typically using monitoring tools. Things like Prometheus, Micrometer are common in the Java world, or you integrate with cloud provider monitoring services like AWS CloudWatch or Google Cloud Monitoring. They expose these vital stats so engineers can see them on dashboards and, act on them if something looks off.
That data is so crucial for fine-tuning, I bet. Okay, let's take the discussion maybe to the next level now. For these really large-scale applications, think global services, huge websites, a single in-memory cache on one server often just isn't enough, right? It can't handle the sheer volume of users and data.
And not even close. It becomes a bottleneck itself.
So how do these global high-traffic systems manage massive loads and ensure constant availability, even if, say, a server goes down?
Yeah, this is where distributed caches step onto the scene. They are absolutely necessary at that scale. The basic idea is to spread the cache data across multiple servers or nodes. This offers much higher scalability. You can handle more load just by adding more nodes. It also gives you higher availability and fault tolerance compared to a single node, which is a single point of failure. You've likely heard of some popular examples, things like Redis, often used in clusters, or Hazelcast, or Memcache.
Right, those names come up a lot.
They do. And the key challenges and solutions in designing and managing these distributed systems are, well, truly fascinating from an engineering perspective. You have to deal with replication. That involves creating copies of data across multiple nodes. So if one node fails, another one still has the data. Master-slave replication is a common pattern here.
Keeping copies for safety.
Exactly. Then there's consistency. This is a big one. How do you ensure all clients see the same up-to-date data, especially after updates, when the data might exist on multiple nodes? This involves some really complex trade-offs.
Sounds hard.
It is. Then there's sharding or partitioning. How do you actually split the data across all the different cache nodes? Usually it's based on the key, often using clever algorithms like consistent hashing, so you can handle much larger data sets and higher request loads than any single node could. And related to replication is fault tolerance, designing the whole system so it can continue operating, maybe in a degraded mode, but still operating, even if some of the cache nodes go down unexpectedly.
Wow, lots to consider there.
Oh, yeah. And speaking of distributed caches and those trade-offs, especially consistency, you'll inevitably bump into the CAP theorem.
The CAP theorem. Consistency, availability, partition tolerance.
That's the one. And it's not just like a theoretical concept you learn in school. It's a harsh reality check in distributed system design. It basically forces engineers to make a fundamental, often painful choice. You typically can't have perfect consistency and perfect availability and perfect partition tolerance, which you must have in a distributed system, all at the same time. So you have to choose which two you prioritize. Do you prioritize always being available, even if data might be slightly out of sync for a moment between nodes? Think maybe like a social media feed.
Okay, availability over perfect consistency.
Right. Or do you ensure absolute consistency? Every read sees the most recent write, even if it means sometimes sacrificing availability during network issues or updates. Think more like banking transactions.
Where consistency is non-negotiable.
Exactly. The key insight from CAP is you can't have all three perfectly, and that trade-off you're forced to make defines your distributed system's fundamental behavior under duress. It's a cornerstone of system design.
Wow, that CAP theorem really does put things into perspective, doesn't it?
Okay.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, what does this all mean for us? Our deep dive today has shown us, I think, that a cache is far more than just a simple key value store. That was just the start.
Just the beginning.
It's actually a really sophisticated component. Its effectiveness hinges on all these thoughtful design choices we talked about. The core data structure, yes, but also eviction policies, expiry mechanisms, concurrency handling, capacity management.
All those pieces matter.
And then for large-scale systems, understanding distributed caching, replication, sharding, and those inherent CAP theorem trade-offs becomes absolutely paramount. By mastering these components, engineers can significantly boost the performance, the responsiveness, and the resilience of their applications. And hopefully by understanding this, you, the listener, gain a deeper appreciation for all the intricate engineering humming along behind the scenes in the digital world you interact with every single day.
Yeah, and maybe this raises an important question to ponder. When you think about the apps and websites you use constantly every day, where else in your digital life do you suspect caching is silently at work? Making things faster, more reliable, without you even realizing it's there.
It's truly incredible when you stop to think about it. All the complex, intricate design decisions happening behind the smooth, fast performance you experience, all thanks to components like the ones we've explored in this deep dive.